The studio lights were blinding, cutting through the silence like blades, casting every expression into sharp relief. Cameras zoomed in, microphones captured the faintest breath, and the nation leaned in as if the entire country were seated in that room. At the center of it all stood Alan Dershowitz, his voice dripping with condescension, his words sharpened not by reason, but by arrogance. With a smirk that felt rehearsed, he dismissed Jasmine Crockett's credentials in one brutal jab, her law degree, her years of study, her dedication, reduced to nothing more than a punchline. The air changed instantly. A ripple of unease ran through the audience, a mixture of gasps and nervous laughter. It was the kind of moment that demanded you choose a side. Would you nod along with the arrogance of power, or would you recoil, knowing something deeply unjust had just been spoken? Dershowitz carried himself like a man untouchable, basking in the echo of his insult, convinced his reputation shielded him from consequence. But across from him, Jasmine Crockett did not flinch. Her eyes did not dart away. Her breath did not quicken. Instead, she held still, steady, a storm quietly gathering behind her calm. The insult hung in the air, lingering like smoke, daring her to react. The cameras lingered on her face, capturing every fraction of a second as America waited to see if she would break. Dershowitz shifted slightly, leaning back in his chair with the confidence of a man who believed he had already won. But in that silence, in that pause where the entire room seemed to hold its breath, something began to change. Because no one expected what came next, a reply so precise, so devastating that it would echo far beyond this debate. This was not just another debate. It was not simply two voices sparring under the glare of the lights. It was a collision of symbols. A man who had spent decades wielding influence inside the ivory towers of American law, and a woman who carried with her the weight of a different story, one that many in power had always tried to dismiss. Alan. Dershowitz did not come into this room as an equal participant. He came cloaked in reputation. For years, his name had been synonymous with courtroom genius, with television appearances, with the air of authority that only the establishment can bestow. To many, he seemed untouchable, a relic of old power that could not be shaken. His words carried not just his voice but the accumulated weight of a system built to favor people like him. But that night, the stakes were bigger than him. They were bigger than Jasmine Crockett. This was about what it means to belong, what it means to be seen, and what it costs to be underestimated. When Dershowitz dismissed her degree, he was not just questioning one woman's legitimacy. He was insulting the thousands who had walked the same road, students who had scraped together tuition, families who had sacrificed, immigrants who had worked twice as hard only to be told they were still not enough. His insult was not a single comment. It was an echo of centuries of condescension. And yet, there she sat, calm, unbroken, a living contradiction to every stereotype he had thrown in her direction. In that silence, viewers felt something shift. Here was a man using all the armor of privilege, and here was a woman whose strength came not from legacy, but from survival, from resilience, from the certainty that her place had been earned. The cameras swung between them, magnifying the divide. The old guard basking in his own certainty, and the newcomer underestimated by nearly everyone in the room. The air buzzed with unspoken tension, as if the entire nation were waiting to see whether she would crumble or rise. What unfolded in the moments ahead would not just level the playing field, it would flip the script entirely. Alan Dershowitz did not arrive at this moment by accident. For decades, his name carried a kind of inevitability, the sound of authority wrapped in prestige. He was the professor quoted on cable news, the lawyer who had defended both the powerful and the controversial, the man who positioned himself as a guardian of constitutional principles. To his admirers, he was a scholar unafraid to wade into the murkiest waters of the legal system. But to others, his career told a different story, one of contradictions, opportunism, and an arrogance that only grew with time. In the beginning, Dershowitz was hailed as a defender of civil liberties, the young professor who challenged orthodoxy and stood boldly in defense of free speech. He spoke often about justice, about fairness, about standing up for unpopular clients because the Constitution demanded it. Yet as the years passed, those lofty ideals seemed less like guiding lights and more like convenient shields. He moved from one high-profile case to another, attaching his name to the headlines of the day. Defending the unpopular had once been framed as courage. Eventually, it looked more like hunger for relevance. The contradictions became impossible to ignore. He would speak of principles but sit comfortably beside men accused of corruption, abuse, and deceit. He would thunder about the importance of truth while bending his arguments to fit whichever client kept him in the spotlight. Each time he would insist it was about law, not loyalty, but the image he projected told a harsher truth. Alan Dershowitz had become less a champion of principle and more a man addicted to being at the center of attention. And with that addiction came arrogance. He wore it like a second skin, walking into rooms certain that no one could challenge his status. He carried the weight of Harvard behind him, the aura of experience, the smug certainty that the establishment would always shield its own. In moments like this debate, that arrogance did not hide itself. It strutted openly, visible in the smirk he flashed after his insult, in the way he leaned back as if the conversation belonged to him. His tone did not just question Jasmine Crockett's law degree. It implied that no degree outside his world was worth recognition at all. It was the purest form of elitism, spoken not just to Crockett but to anyone who had ever dared to rise without permission from men like him. The audience felt it too. The weight of his words was not the weight of wisdom but of entitlement. It was the sound of a man who had convinced himself that history owed him reverence, that his voice could still silence any challenger. But beneath that sheen of authority, cracks were forming. The country had changed, the people had changed, and arrogance has a way of collapsing when it collides with truth spoken plainly. And in this moment, arrogance was about to meet its breaking point. Jasmine Crockett's path could not have been more different from the man seated across from her. She did not inherit privilege, nor was she handed platforms simply because of her name. Her journey began in a world where nothing was guaranteed, where every step forward required twice the effort just to be seen. Raised in a community where opportunities were scarce but determination was abundant, she learned early that dignity was not given. It was built through persistence, sacrifice, and resilience. Education became her weapon. While others doubted her, while whispers suggested that doors like Harvard or Yale were reserved for children of power, Crockett carved her own way through the barriers. Her law degree was not a trophy of prestige. It was proof of survival. At DU was late nights, endless debt, and sacrifices that extended far beyond herself. It was the prayers of parents and grandparents who had endured indignities so she could stand tall. Every page she studied was written against the backdrop of a system designed to tell her she did not belong. And yet she endured, not because the path was smooth, but because she refused to let the struggle define her limits. That struggle shaped her voice. In courtrooms, she knew what it meant to be the only black woman present, to have her words interrupted, her intelligence doubted, her very presence questioned. But she also knew how to command silence, how to let the weight of truth speak louder than the noise of dismissal. Her career was not about chasing headlines. It was about giving voice to those who had been ignored, defending those who had been cast aside, and embodying the pride of communities who rarely saw themselves represented in halls of power. And so, when Alan Dershowitz tried to reduce her degree to a punchline, he was not just mocking one woman's achievement. He was mocking the very idea that someone who did not look like him, who did not come from his world, could rise to stand beside him. But Crockett had been dismissed before. She had been told not enough more times than she could count. And every time she answered not with rage but with clarity, with presence, with the unshakable dignity that comes from knowing, your place has been earned. That composure seen on camera was no accident. It was not weakness nor hesitation. It was the product of a lifetime spent walking into rooms where silence was expected of her, and instead choosing to speak. It was the discipline of someone who understood that every word she uttered would echo for more than just herself. She represented millions who had been underestimated, belittled, or silenced. And in that moment, she carried all of them with her. and this night would prove why she was uniquely prepared. The silence after Dershowitz's insult stretched longer than anyone expected. It was not the silence of surrender, but the silence before a storm. His smirk lingered, feeding on the discomfort in the room as if he believed her hesitation was proof of his superiority. He leaned forward, doubling down with another jab, his tone laced with mockery, as though repeating the insult would make it sting deeper. His words rolled out like a lecture, designed to remind everyone watching of his pedigree, his connections, his assumed dominance. But while he spoke, Jasmine Crockett remained composed. She did not fidget, she did not break eye contact, and she did not grant him the satisfaction of a visible reaction. Instead, her stillness became louder than his voice. It was a stillness born of experience, the kind that only someone who had been underestimated her entire life could wield. Her eyes carried the weight of restraint, as though she were carefully choosing not only when to strike but how. The tension in the room thickened. Viewers at home could feel it too, the imbalance of power being tested in real time. Dershowitz's words grew sharper, his delivery more desperate, as though he could sense that his dominance was slipping even before she had spoken. He gestured with his hands, raising his voice, trying to corner her into submission. But with every outburst it became clearer. His arrogance was beginning to crack. The contrast was undeniable. On one side, a man puffed up by decades of entitlement, throwing his weight around with the desperation of someone who could not tolerate being challenged. On the other, a woman sitting with a calmness that felt like defiance, as if she had already won by refusing to stoop to his level. Each second she stayed silent, the anticipation grew. America was no longer just listening to what Dershowitz said. They were waiting to hear what she would finally unleash. And that wait made her power even stronger. Because silence, when held with purpose, does not signal weakness. It signals control. Dershowitz spoke as though he owned the room. But slowly, the energy shifted. It was not his voice commanding attention anymore, it was her restraint. The cameras stayed fixed on her, the audience holding its breath, the tension reaching the breaking point. The villain had thrown everything he had into his insult, into his arrogance. Now all that remained was the question burning in every viewer's mind. When she finally opened her mouth, what would she say? When Jasmine Crockett finally spoke, her voice did not rise in anger. It was calm, steady, the kind of calm that cuts deeper than shouting ever could. She looked directly at Alan Dershowitz, her expression unwavering, and began with words that immediately shifted the balance of power. "Professor," she said, her tone respectful yet firm, "you may diminish my degree, but you cannot diminish the truth of my work, nor the communities I serve." The words landed with a weight that hung heavy in the air, and for the first time, Dershowitz's smirk faltered. She did not rush. Each sentence carried deliberate force, like a hammer striking slowly but decisively. She reminded him, and everyone listening, that her law degree was not handed down by privilege or legacy. It was earned through struggle, through sacrifice, through battles fought in courtrooms where the odds were never in her favor. Her credentials were not only academic, they were lived. She had stood beside clients who had nothing but their dignity, and she had defended them against systems that would have swallowed them whole. "So, when you attempt to mock my education," she continued, "you are mocking every person who has been told they are not enough and still fought their way forward." The room shifted. Whispers spread. Some gasped openly. Even the cameras seemed to linger longer on her face, recognizing that a moment larger than debate was unfolding. Dershowitz leaned back, blinking rapidly, his lips tightening as though he could not decide whether to interrupt or remain silent. The man who moments earlier had owned the stage now looked suddenly smaller, exposed under the very lights that once magnified his authority. Crockett pressed on, her words cutting not with cruelty but with clarity. She spoke of her roots, of her community, of the countless nights spent studying not to chase prestige, but to defend justice. She reminded everyone that law is not about who can recite cases with flair. It is about who has the courage to stand up for those who cannot stand up for themselves. The power of a degree, she declared, is not in the name of the institution, it is in the work done with it. The audience erupted. Some clapped, others murmured, and the tension broke into open acknowledgement of her strength. Social media in real time began to buzz, hashtags forming around her name, snippets of her words clipped and shared within minutes. Even commentators accustomed to playing it safe nodded with visible admiration. What began as a moment of condescension had transformed into a defining stand. Dershowitz attempted a rebuttal, his words stumbling over themselves. He insisted he had only been making a point about standards, but his voice carried no conviction. The crowd no longer leaned toward him. Their focus remained on her. Every twitch of his hand, every strained chuckle only underscored the collapse of his certainty. His arrogance was dissolving in real time, and he knew it. Crockett closed with precision, not rage. Respect, she said firmly, is not claimed through insults, it is earned through service, and that is something I will never let anyone take from me. The final words hit like a gavel slamming down, final and unarguable. The room erupted again, louder this time, the kind of reaction that signaled something bigger than debate had just taken place. Dershowitz sat back, silent, diminished, his earlier confidence shattered. And yet, the true power of her reply was only beginning to unfold. Because what happened in that room did not stay there. It spread outward, igniting a fire far beyond those walls. The moment her words left her lips, the ripple effect began. Inside the studio, the audience buzzed with energy, murmurs turning into applause that refused to die down. Some rose to their feet, clapping in disbelief at what they had just witnessed. The moderators exchanged glances, caught off guard by the eruption, while Dershowitz sat stiffly, his expression betraying the discomfort of a man no longer in control. The power dynamic had shifted, and everyone knew it. But the true shockwaves came after. Within minutes, clips of Crockett's response hit social media. On Twitter, hashtags like Crockett clapback and degrees of truth trended nationally. On Instagram, short reels of her calm takedown were shared by influencers, activists, even celebrities who rarely waded into politics. The words that had silenced Dershowitz were suddenly echoing across millions of screens, replayed again and again with captions like, "This is how you fight arrogance," and "She spoke for all of us." Legal experts weighed in almost immediately. Commentators who had once treated Dershowitz as untouchable admitted, sometimes grudgingly, that he had been dismantled in real time. Progressive voices hailed the moment as a cultural reset. No longer could pedigree and arrogance alone dominate the stage. Even some conservative pundits attempting to downplay it only amplified the story by acknowledging its force. In communities far from the studio, her words carried a deeper resonance. Immigrants, first-generation students, and young lawyers posted their own stories under her quotes, describing the countless times they too had been told they were not enough. Her reply became more than a defense. It became a banner for dignity, a statement of belonging that millions attached themselves to. And Dershowitz? His attempts to explain, to soften, to rewrite what had happened, only made things worse. Every word he spoke afterward felt smaller, weaker, as if the debate had permanently shifted the weight of authority away from him. His stature, once unshakable, now looked fragile. It was clear, this was no longer about a single debate, or even a single insult. It was about what America had just witnessed, a clash between arrogance and dignity, and the undeniable victory of the latter. But the story was not finished. Because what began as one woman's defense was about to be transformed into something even larger, a moral lesson for an entire nation. Crockett's rebuttal was never just about silencing an insult. It was about something far deeper, something that resonated with anyone who had ever been told they did not belong in a room where decisions were made. Her words became more than a shield. They were a mirror, forcing the nation to see the stark difference between arrogance and dignity. Where her opponent tried to reduce her presence to a spectacle, she transformed that moment into a statement of purpose. What shone through was not anger, but clarity. She stood not only for herself but for every teacher who had been dismissed as unqualified, Every immigrant who had been told their accent was a weakness. Every woman of color who had been reduced to a stereotype before she had even spoken. Her poise was not performance. It was resistance refined into eloquence, courage sharpened into conviction. In that chamber, power did not look like the loudest voice. It looked like a black woman refusing to bend, her words carrying the weight of generations who had fought to be heard. She reminded America that the measure of leadership is not found in cruelty, but in the ability to stand in the storm and hold steady. The moral was clear. Dignity is not passive, it is active defiance against those who would strip humanity down to insult. Truth is not fragile. It is resilient enough to pierce through the staged performances of the privileged. Equality is not given. It is earned through moments like this when one person refuses to play small so that others might walk taller. And so when the echoes of that night faded, it was not the insult that endured. It was the dignity with which it was destroyed. That was the lesson. That was the legacy. Crockett had shown the nation that composure could be sharper than any blade, that justice could be spoken in tones that carried further than any shout. The question now was whether America was ready to remember not just the clash, but the choice it revealed. Would the country choose arrogance, or would it finally choose justice? And so, we return to the moment that started it all. A careless insult thrown like a weapon meant to wound and belittle. But instead of cutting her down, it became the stage upon which dignity stood taller than arrogance. That night proved something powerful. The loudest sneer will always fade, but the voice grounded in truth will echo far longer. Crockett's response was not remembered for its fire, but for its balance. It was the reminder that real strength is not found in cruelty, but in composure. Arrogance falls under the weight of its own emptiness, while dignity rises because it speaks to something larger than ego. It speaks to justice, to belonging, to the promise of a country still struggling to live up to its ideals. This story is not just hers. It belongs to anyone who has been told they are too much, too loud, too different, too unworthy, and who still refuses to bow. If you believe voices like hers matter, share this story, subscribe, and let this be the moment you carry forward. Because when dignity rises, it lifts us all, and it is time America rose with it.